BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Mondays, I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And this week on the program, I will be joined by Eddie McNamara. He is the author of the new book, Zodiactually, the real story of a fake serial killer. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, Eddie McNamara has been a guest on the program in the past, and that was at the start of his research journey when he was working on his new book, Zodiactually, and now he is going to return, and he's going to give us the full story of his research and expeditions into the Zodiac Killer case. And I also want to remind you guys that in addition to Zodiac Monday, this show also comes to you Monday through Friday talking about unsolved mysteries. Feel free to start your day with some mystery talk in the morning. On Mondays about the Zodiac Killer, on Tuesdays about JonBenet Ramsey, on Wednesdays about Jack the Ripper, on Thursdays about the Black Dahlia, and on Fridays about D.B. Cooper. And I also release shorts and reels that talk about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. And I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts before the interview starts. If you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one goes to Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. Batman bought you a coffee. I never get tired of saying that. And Batman66 simply has a very quick message, and that is Zodiac Mondays. Certainly. And our next one goes to River Prawn Pottery, another regular and consistent supporter. River Prawn Pottery, thank you so much. And of course we have CZ Guy. CZ Guy is another regular and consistent supporter, and we have one here on buymeacoffee.com from Mike F., who has a message saying, "Congrats on 6,000 subscribers. Enjoying the diversity of topics and variety of guests on Zodiac and others. Haven't fallen into the Cooper vortex yet, but my toes are in the water. Greetings from Texas." And thank you, Mike F., so much for that. And yes, every Friday is Cooper Friday, and I am getting pulled more and more deeply into the vortex. If you can go deep into the vortex, that is. And I think it's just because I'm becoming more familiar with the D.B. Cooper case. It's one of the newer segments for Black Box Online Radio. Even though it's been almost 2 years since I started talking about D.B. Cooper on this channel, I think I'm just at a point where I'm learning more things, but I'm also becoming more fascinated by different disciplines within the world of D.B. Cooper research. Anyway, I invite you guys to check out Cooper Friday here on Black Box Online Radio. And we have another supporter shout-out going to Classic Chevy Cat from buymeacoffee.com. And Classic Chevy Cat says, "I'm so happy you've got over 6,000 subscribers now. You deserve this, Ned. You have the most thoughtful, concise, and interesting shows, and I want you to know how much I appreciate you." Well, thank you so much for that. And, I thank all of the supporters on buymeacoffee.com as well as via the super thanks and super chats when I go live. And I just wanted to cover those very quickly so we can get straight into the interview now. And let's bring Eddie McNamara on the program. Actually, the real story of a fake serial killer. Eddie has also written 2 other books, Brooklyn Hardcore, a novel, and the short story collection Two Fair Zone. And he's been a guest on Black Box Online Radio in the past. Eddie, how are you doing?
Hey, Ned, how are you? Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, you're welcome, and thanks for being a guest. Now, you've written this book, Zodiactually, the real story of a fake serial killer. And I think that the majority of people who are listening to this program would like to know, what do you mean by a fake serial killer?
Okay, so I'm contrasting the actual evidence, things that happened, things that the police knew with the story of the Zodiac. So the commonly, the pop culture slash true crime story, the one that was in the newspapers in the 60s, the one that Gray Smith published in the 80s, the Fincher film that made $85 million, is a Zodiac story that has one man responsible for five murders in four different crime scenes between 68 and 69. He does two phone calls, multiple letters and ciphers to the newspapers. And that is the Zodiac narrative. And that is a fake narrative. I don't believe that to be accurate. Um, and that I believe that narrative ultimately it's a compelling story, and I see why people liked it. And it made for a great book and a great movie, and it made for a lot of interesting websites. But it's not something that aligns with reality. And I looked at this case very meat and potatoes, looking for the real story in this, and not the sensationalist story. So that's the contrast I'm making with this book. I get to the what actually happened, not what's a great story that would make an $85 million movie.
Okay, and thank you for that, Eddie. And just in case the audience is not familiar with your work or they didn't hear your previous appearances on BBO War, when did you first learn about the Zodiac Killer?
I mean, I was a teenager in the '90s, so I've known about the Zodiac Killer for a while, but I didn't become particularly interested in the Zodiac until COVID lockdown. I was reading a book about San Francisco, Jeffrey Toobin's Heiress about Patty Hearst, and then I read Jared Kobeck's Motor Spirit about the Zodiac era, and I got really interested in the era, and I started looking into it, and I'm fascinated by history, and I was fascinated about this unsolved murder that seems like it should have been solved.
And for the audience as well, you are a former member of law enforcement, correct?
Yeah, I was a police officer for 7 years in New York. It was 7 years because I was a 9/11 first responder, but I was also a 9/11 last responder, meaning I spent 9 months at the World Trade Center site working in rescue and recovery. And after that, I dealt with some PTSD issues, and I was able to retire with a line of duty injury. So I think also that experience of working at the World Trade Center for 9 months, for 12 to 20 hours a day, puts me in a pretty unique position where I am of the belief that there are certain things the police know, and there are certain things in the newspaper, and those are not the same things always.
And I'm sure a lot of the listeners of Black Box Online Radio, as well as myself, really appreciate the work that you did as a first responder and a last responder, as you said. But to stay focused on the Zodiac Killer today, you wrote this book, Zodiactually, the real story of a fake serial killer. I'm going to ask you a very direct question. Are you a supporter of the Zodiac Killer hoax theory?
Folks, that would be the Thomas Horan myth of the Zodiac hoax theory.
That's what
Am I a
he called.
supporter?
I'd like to know what you think.
Yeah, I think somewhat, but I have a very different take than Haran. I don't necessarily think. I think it was more of a media story that they kept running with despite changing information. And I think I proved that in the book, and I can explain that in this conversation.
Certainly, because when I was reading your book, it sounds like you are looking at how there were murders that took place in California. Real murders happened. So when we use the term hoax, I mean, that's what it's called, the Zodiac hoax theory. I didn't invent that term. You didn't invent that term, but real murders happened. However, I do think that your take on the subject is completely different than what Thomas Horan has talked about in regards to the suspects. But is this a fair way of putting it? You support the claim that there were multiple homicides that took place with multiple killers, And these killers were not necessarily connected, and there may be some connections, but ultimately, somebody wrote letters taking credit for crimes that he did not commit and tried to make the public think that this was the Zodiac Killer. Did I get that right?
Yeah, yes, I do agree with that. I do think there's a distinct possibility that Darlene Ferrin's murderer from the July 4th murder was also the 1969 letter writer. But otherwise, yes, I believe that there are unrelated murders that were lumped together for the sake of either a distraction for the person, for the murderer at Blue Rock Springs, or the entire thing was lumped together for a compelling narrative.
Well, that's going to beg the question of if this single Zodiac killer didn't commit the homicides in 1968 and 69, well, who did? Why don't we start with the Lake Herman Road murders? And you devote a substantial portion of your book to discussing the Lake Herman Road murders. So why don't we begin there? Would you like to give us your analysis of Lake Herman Road?
Sure, and I think this is very important, and thank you for allowing me to do this. I think we can dismantle the entire Zodiac story, the entire popular narrative, by looking at the foundation of the story, and the foundation being Lake Herman Road as the first two Zodiac murders. Just looking back, we now know that investigators have known that Lake Herman Road was not a Zodiac murder since 1970. This is something that the early Solano investigators, the early Vallejo investigators knew. This is something that the cold case detectives in 1991 and 92 knew, and then they didn't consider this at the time. They stopped considering this Zodiac, and they thought Zodiac began July 4th, 69, and the Lake Herman Road murders were done by somebody else. And this information has long been public. This was stated, by multiple early detectives. Bauer, Conway, Lynch, Rust, Cunningham, Lundblot even passed this on to people. This is something that has been known for a long time, but it doesn't sort of suit the story. So a lot of people have overlooked it. There's quotes that they had given on television shows in the 80s that we didn't think those were Zodiac. Those kids weren't Zodiac. I knew this was a drug crime. The cold case detective said that we were satisfied that Lake Herman Road was a local gang and had nothing to do with Zodiac. They've been saying this for a really long time. And even the top expert, Tom Voigt, sort of in 2002 on Zodiackiller.com forum that he has, and he's an excellent researcher. He said, I'm not saying I believe McGrath, who is the suspect, or anyone else in his gang was the Zodiac. Rather, I think it's possible they may have been responsible for the Lake Herman Road killings. And Voigt said that in 2002.
And when you say McGrath, I mean, to provide some context for the audience, there was a gang of individuals who was operating in Vallejo, and in your book you refer to them as the Vallejo Thrill Killers, correct?
Yes, and Dave McGrath was the main guy in this gang.
And there's another one that you talk about in your book, and you provide a pseudonym for him, correct? But would you like to tell us the name of the pseudonym that you give to the suspect?
Sure. The name I use for the suspect is John Holmberg, and he was Dave McGrath's best friend, and it's a really tragic story. The John Holmberg story is a really tragic story because he was convicted alongside Dave McGrath for a murder, a kidnapping, and an attempted murder on June 3rd, 1969 in Vallejo. And a year later, Dave McGrath wrote an affidavit, and this man they were both on death row together, wrote an affidavit saying that he lied and perjured himself on the stand to put the blame on this other person. And, so that's really heavy. And yeah, so this is it's a wild story. This Dave, I mean, you could do a whole book about this Dave McGrath guy. It's almost unbelievable.
Yes, though, but when you talk about them in the book, they don't actually sound like ordinary street thugs. I mean, you describe Dave McGrath as someone who is gifted, and John Holmberg is described as somebody who had an IQ of 130. Very frequently, he was the smartest person in the room when he was interacting with individuals in these circles, and they don't sound like the ordinary type of drug pushing street thugs or the people that would pull guns on someone for an armed robbery. But did they just fall on the other side of the tracks? And I don't mean for you to kind of like recreate history, but is that kind of your impression? I kind of had that takeaway from reading your book, Zodiactually, that these guys were kind of smart, well-behaved individuals. You even shared the photo of Dave McGrath in your book, and he looks like a very neat, clean-cut individual, totally non-threatening. But would you say that that was the case?
Absolutely. I spoke to a ton of people about who knew Dave McGrath. I spoke to his girlfriend, to friends of his, to newspaper reporters who knew him, just all sorts of people who went to high school with him, and everyone enthusiastically told me what a nice guy he was. But then there was a caveat that Dave was a great guy, and then he started using drugs. And once Dave was using drugs, it was like a Jekyll and Hyde situation where like a switch would be flipped in him. He was like this really, caring. He was a ballet dancer. He danced with the Soviet Killer of ballet. He was like a really talented dude, and he got heavily into drugs, and he got into doing speed and LSD at the same time, which is a nasty combination. And apparently, when he was high like this, he was ultra violent and a completely different person. So sober Dave is a nice guy, but high Dave is a absolute menace.
And there was one story in your book where you even said that he just killed somebody's dog, and you even talked about, comparison to the John Wick films, but also just about how cruel and cold that would have to be, because it sounded like somewhat of a senseless or unjustifiable act, correct?
Yeah, it's actually a really crazy story. Dave was a drug dealer, and he was sitting with two drug dealers that worked for him and sold drugs at Vallejo High School, and one sold at Hogan High School. And someone was talking about a guard dog at a place called the Dairy Barn, and this was like a vicious guard dog. And I guess they were talking about how the Dairy Barn is the only place in Vallejo that hasn't been robbed because this dog is so scary. And these guys did test. One of these guys did testify at Dave's murder trial that he drove out to the Dairy Barn, went there, shot the dog, killed the dog, came back and bragged to them about how he killed the dog. And it's just a senseless kind of, it's one of the many senseless things. Dave McGrath, he there's also stories from his criminal associates about how he would just take shots at people. With he had an M1 carbine gun and he had a 22 pistol, and he would just randomly take shots at people in the street. And Dave McGrath is also 2 weeks after the Lake Herman Road murders. Someone else named Matthew Burrell, a 46-year-old man, was shot in a car in Vallejo in a parking lot. It was Matthew Burrell's birthday. The gun he was shot with was ballistically matched to the murder weapon in the gas station murders that the Vallejo thrill killers did. So Dave McGrath is also on the hook for this Matthew Burrell murder on January 3rd of 69.
Okay, though, so just for the audience, so we can arrange everything, we have this group that are known as the Vallejo Thrill Killers. We have Dave McGrath, we have John Holmberg, and who are the other members of this group? And, you can be as vague and general as you want,
Sure,
just so they can understand
sure.
how many people, their names, and as we go along.
I think the most important member is a man named Daryl Cousins, and he went by the street name Pussgut. He's an outlaw biker, and he's a major drug supplier in the area at the time. Dave is a drug dealer, but this is the guy who supplies speed, weed, and different types of opiates like Demerol and all sorts of things like this. He's a really dangerous guy. He's a part of a criminal organization. He's a gang member, and he has a right hand man that's always with him. His name is Daryl Walters. So they're both Daryls, two Daryls. And then the other members of this gang are the Donahue brothers, and they're not criminals. They're like knock around guys. They're just like local dudes, and then there's the Doyle brothers, and they're drug dealers. They're sort of small time high school drug dealers who work for Dave McGrath.
And I also want to share some things for the audience where a lot of people have to understand about the way that things went about in the 1960s. There were fewer forms of documentation, electronic communication did not exist, and a lot of criminals would get together, or sometimes just individuals who were just going out and partying and being reckless and letting loose. And they would go on these crime sprees where they're mostly just wreaking havoc. Sometimes the intention is to commit crimes, other times the intention is just to do a bunch of drugs and be chaotic. And this happened very frequently in California, perhaps throughout the United States. A very clear example of this is the Sandy story in Southern California in 1963 that saw the death of Vern Smith, where J.C. Reed and James Coleman and Sandy are just kind of roaming about and they're causing trouble. And also, other Zodiac killer suspects lived lifestyles where they would just kind of like go out for several nights, several days, and they would do literally whatever they wanted. It was chaotic, it was destructive. Sometimes people died, and as a result of these events. I just told you about the name of Vern Smith, the man who died as murdered by Sandy. So with these types of criminals, this is hardly an isolated incident. This is hardly just something unique about how this gang of thrill killers is getting together. And you even pointed out there are connections to other crimes, but it was fairly commonplace for these things to happen throughout California and the country, right?
Yeah, it was. It definitely wasn't unheard of. There were even if we look at the very specific area of Vallejo and Napa County, between I think it's September of '68 and September of '69, there were 23 murders, and there's probably 15 shootings, and basically many service stations are robbed, and there's shootings at those service stations. And there's just like, yeah, there's just like this kind of mayhem that's going on. It's happening also outside of Vallejo, all around California. There's people holding up service stations, there's shootings involved. It's crime is spiking between, I think it's like 1965 and 1991. The crime rate quadrupled. So it's in the middle of this, this period we're talking about is the middle of this sort of spike in violent crime. So yeah, it is more common than it would have been 10 years earlier.
Okay, then, how do we get to Lake Herman Road, December 20th, 1968? We have the first crimes that have been attributed to the Zodiac Killer in the canonical narrative, the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. And you don't have to give away everything from your book. I mean, I'm sure you want to save some things for the readers, but I think that everybody who's listening to this program right now would like to know, how do you think that crime went down? And share as much detail as you like or as little detail as you would like. What do you think happened?
Okay, so I guess let me go with what evidence we have from the crime scene. So let me give you what we have right now. So Dave McGrath in 1970, he's on death row. He's at San Quentin prison. He signs this affidavit saying that John Holmberg, he lied, got John Holmberg unfairly convicted for being his partner in crime and murder. Then he speaks to Sergeant Terry Cunningham of the Solano County Sheriff's Office. And Dave McGrath tells Sergeant Cunningham that he was present at the Lake Herman Road murders. He was not the shooter, but he was in the car at the Lake Herman Road murders. Also in 1970, Dave's associate, and I think you mentioned this 2 weeks ago on the show that you didn't know who. I guess nobody was saying with the hoax theory who the confidential informant was. Well, the confidential informant is Dave's his drug supplier, Pussgut, whose name is Darrell Walters. He gets caught up in a bunch of crimes in late '69, a few gun crimes, violent crimes, drug crimes. His wife dies of an overdose, and he tells police that Dave McGrath and another guy committed the Lake Herman Road murders. And so we think about the evidence at Lake Herman Road, and David Faraday was shot once execution style behind the ear with a .22 long barreled pistol. Betty Lou Jensen apparently escaping the vehicle, was shot in the back 5 times with a 22 long-barreled pistol. Dave McGrath was convicted in 1969 of robbing 5 shortstop markets with a 22 long-barreled pistol. Dave McGrath was convicted of a murder and attempted murder and kidnapping in late 1969. The murders play out almost exactly the same way as the Lake Herman Road murders. Dave shot a man named Dennis Tapp had the man sit down on the ground and shot the man in the head and then left. And he kidnapped another man named Stephen Tompkins, drove the man out to Blue Rock Springs, told him that he was free to go. Tompkins exited the vehicle. Dave McGrath shot him 5 times in the back.
Now, is it certifiable that this individual, Puscott, was a confidential informant?
It's is it certifiable? Like, yeah, like
Is it documented?
Yeah, but we, if a Vallejo cop reads this book, or if a Solano sheriff's officer reads this book, please, please find the report. Because I've requested this for a long time, and they're not very, they're not very forthcoming with the FOIA requests about these things. But it makes sense. The guy is involved in a bunch of, like, okay, so we have to just now look at it. The guy's involved in a bunch of violent gun crimes, and he never ends up going to jail. He keeps getting suspended sentences, and he keeps getting probation. But he's an absolute menace. He's breaking into people's houses. He's robbing them at gunpoint. He's doing home invasions. He's menacing people with guns in the street, and nothing ever happens to him. There's no consequence. So if we infer, it has all the all the markings of a confidential informant. But yes, there's definitely going to be paperwork on that. Whether it exists or not anymore, that's the question.
And his name was Daryl. What was his last name again?
Cousins. Cussins.
Daryl Cousins. Okay. So we have the Lake Herman Road murders that were committed with the 22 caliber firearm, and the Zodiac Killer, or someone pretending to be the Zodiac, would ultimately take credit for this crime in a letter. But some people believe this to this day, that the way the Zodiac shared the version of the events is accurate, that the crimes were committed by taping a pencil flashlight to the barrel of the 22 caliber firearm. But when I was reading your book, I got the impression that you were saying that you thought that was made up, that was just something that was a fictitious detail. Did I get you correctly?
Well, I think that detail may or may not be true. I think it's likely to be a fictitious detail, but I think in that Zodiac letter, the Zodiac catches him. He digs himself into a lie when he says that he put the pencil flashlight on top of the gun and then sprayed bullets like it was a water hose. Now, knowing about the crime, we know that David Faraday was murdered execution style with 1 bullet behind his left ear. That's not spraying like a water hose. That's an inconsistency between what happened and what was in the Zodiac letter. So I do not find this to be at all reasonable to believe that this is the person who committed the crime.
Okay, then, how do you think it went down? Because there's going to be another car that's going to pull up into that turnoff parking lot at Lake Herman Road. And again, you can be as vague as you want or as specific as you want. Like, do you want to tell us how many people you think were in the car? Who do you think the gunman was? Which member of this Vallejo thrill killers? And please share anything you want.
Okay, so I'll be actually specific about this. Puscott drives a 1959 blue over white Oldsmobile. Dave McGrath has access to, via his girlfriend, a white Chevy Impala. Those are the 2 cars that in police reports are associated with the Lake Herman Road murders. Dave and Puscott drive vehicles. They drive those very similar vehicles. Dave has the 22 gun. He's committed crimes with this 22 pistol, long barrel pistol, which looks like sort of a space gun. It looks like something out of a 50s sci-fi movie. It's a recognizable gun. Dave has it. Dave's convicted of committing crimes with it. Dave has access to a white Impala, and Puscott is driving a 59 blue Oldsmobile. So now, not only is there a gun connection, not only is there a crime connection, now there's a car connection between these individuals and the Lake Herman Road murders. There's no suspect in any of the Zodiac cases that has this type of, any of the Zodiac murders and any suspect people are putting forth. Nobody has as many connections as Dave McGrath to Lake Herman Road.
Do you think that Dave McGrath was the shooter, or do you think that he was just like, the passenger, kind of the way that he shared it?
It's hard to say. I think based on his track record of sort of accusing someone else first and then admitting it was him, I think it's more likely than not that he may have been the shooter.
Okay, though, so what would be the motive for the Lake Herman Road murders? Would it just be a thrill kill, a random crime like we
It's
talked about people just
well,
causing chaos?
that's according to Terry Cunningham. That's what Dave McGrath told him. He told him it was just they were driving around and they saw the kids and they shot them. The Vallejo cops were getting different information. They were getting a lot of snitch information. They were making drug arrests, and people were trying to trade, not go to jail by telling them that Dave McGrath and a partner did the Lake Herman Road murders. So guys like John Lynch and George Bauer, they might believe it had something to do with drugs. I know John Lynch believed that David Faraday, he believed he was a drug informant who told about a drug deal, and these guys were involved in that drug deal and rubbed him out. I'm not sure if that's true, but if you look at the goings on the night of Lake Herman Road, there's a very plausible case that may have been what happened.
Okay, though, so that's what happens at Lake Herman Road. Now, we're going to get to Blue Rock Springs. And I think that you've done a reasonable job in your book showing that there can be connections between Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, but not in the way that people might be expecting. And also, as we've already said, some people might be trying to make the public think that there's this serial killer boogeyman on the loose, when in reality, it could be something else. Would you like to introduce the Blue Rock Springs shooting for the audience?
Sure. On July 4th of '69, Darlene Ferrin, a 22-year-old married mother of a young daughter, and Michael Majot, a 19-year-old laborer, they were at Blue Rock Springs on the 4th of July, which is another sort of it's another lover's lane similar to Lake Herman Road. It's a holiday. It's around midnight, and they're shot by a man pulls up in the car and shoots them a bunch of times into the car. Mike jumps into the back seat, screams. The shooter comes back and puts some more shots into them. Mike survives, and Darlene dies at the scene.
And who do you think was responsible for this? Again, share as much detail as you like.
Okay, I think before we get into that, we have to understand who the victim was, and the victim was Darlene Ferrin. And I think over the years, there's been a lot of misogyny and judgment placed on Darlene Ferrin. And I think a lot of times, it's not to say that it's victim blaming, but Darlene led a very unconventional life. Darlene, she lived in the hate during the summer of love. She had a husband, and they sort of had a bohemian, she called it a gypsy existence around the country and in the Caribbean. So I think a lot of people, Darlene has been sort of judged over time. But what I do think is, and I say in the book, I think I make a big point of this. I do an entire chapter. Darlene was, for most of her life, surrounded by a lot of really awful men. And within this circle of awful men, there are a lot of people, not just one, there are numerous people who make excellent suspects.
Yes, and you also talk in your book about how she had relationships with drug dealers, but she also had relationships with police officers. And when I say relationships, I do genuinely mean that, like interactions, not purely in the romantic sense, although some of that may have taken place. And what you said in Zodiactually was that that was just like a very bad combination, having an inner circle that is associated with the drug world and an inner circle that's associated with law enforcement. So it sounds like there is just a lot of ways in which things could have gone wrong.
Yeah, and I think Darlene is really a tragic figure. I feel for her. I feel like a lot of her, a lot of her decision making was, very questionable. And then you think about, why would someone be this way? But Darlene, she left home as a teenager. She married a guy named Jim Phillips. She got out of her home. It turns out years later, her father was convicted twice guilty of child molestation. Now, we can't say that we know for a fact that anything happened between them, but she grew up in a house with a man who would later be convicted of child molestation. She left the house, married Crabtree, James Phillips Crabtree, um, broke up with him, married Dean Ferrin, and then her father, to repair the relationship, put up a bunch of money to buy Dean and Darlene a house in Vallejo and move her back to Vallejo. So she kind of gets back home through her dad, through repairing relationships with the toxic dad.
Yes, but I also want to be clear about some things, just kind of sharing my own personal note. I mean, Farron may have had unconventional life choices, and I may have even said some unflattering things about her or things that I would regret saying in the past. But ultimately, she was an adult. She had the ability to make her own decisions. She absolutely did not deserve to be murdered, and I know you believe that, Eddie. I'm just kind of saying this for my own personal note because we're going to talk a lot about her connections and her lifestyles, but the fact of the matter is, I mean, she was killed by somebody on July 4th of 1969, maybe July 5th, and she didn't deserve any of that. So if we're going to look a little bit into her life, is there anything else you would like to share before we start talking about the suspects?
Um, well, I think I would immediately, as opposed to the Lake Herman Road case, there's an immediate suspect, and his name is George Waters.
Yes.
And this is a really interesting thing because Darlene's sister, Ed Rust, is the lead detective on the case. At 7 in the morning, he's out at the crime scene looking for evidence, like looking for bullet casings or something. And Darlene's sister approaches Ed Rust and says, basically, that this guy George, he's a bartender in Vallejo, and he's basically a man that harasses and stalks Darlene. And this is very important, that if Darlene has a stalker, it's this guy has to shoot to the top of the list. Stalkers are very dangerous. 81% of stalkers harm the women they're stalking. It's a when women are murdered, they're generally 76% of the time murdered by a man they know. When women have a stalker, more than 8 in 10 of those women are physically harmed by that stalker. If they were in some sort of relationship with that stalker. So this George Waters, right away, is very interesting. So the police immediately latch onto him, and he harasses Darlene, according to her family. They speak to Mike Mageau's twin brother, and he goes further and tells them that, yeah, he knows who George is. And Darlene was deathly afraid of George because George broke into her house and threatened to rape her. And she had to use like verbal judo to prevent that from happening. So she's, scared of this George guy. Then it's learned, Dean Ferrin even knows about this, that George, who he he's out at a bar called the Cat Pad, basically 7 nights a week in Vallejo, and he shows up drunk at Darlene's job at Terry's. She's a waitress. She's a nighttime waitress. He shows up drunk after the strip club and drives her home. And then she calls George sometimes, and he lives in Napa County, and he drives into Vallejo, picks Darlene up, and drops her off at work. So Darlene's stalker is showing up at her job all the time. He threatened to rape her. And then a dancer at the Cat Pad, which is a strip club and was a strip club in Vallejo at the time that a lot of drugs were going through. It's a pretty shady place. She calls the police and tells the police that she heard that one of their regular customers named George bragged about killing Darlene. The police keep looking into George, and it turns out in 1964, George was arrested by the Vallejo police for beating his wife. And in 1964, this man beat his wife so badly that she had an order of protection against him, which was very rare back then. Domestic violence was treated very differently in 64 than it is now. And this guy was bad enough to get an order against him. So this George looks like, I mean, what a slam dunk suspect this is.
But to provide some clarity, there are a lot of stories out there about the man who could have been stalking Darlene Ferrin. Some people might think it was Arthur Lee Allen. Some people might think it was Lawrence Kane. Some people might think it was William Joseph Grant. And this mostly comes from researchers contacting Darlene's family, particularly her sisters. And they asked them to have a look at their suspect. Do you think this could have been the guy? And they more or less would just say, yes, it was Arthur Lee Allen.
Sure.
Yes, it was Lawrence Kane. Yes, it was William Joseph Grant. But it doesn't take long for anybody to get under the surface and see that the quote-unquote stalker was very clearly identified, and he's in the police reports, right? And his name was George Waters.
His name was George Waters. He's in the police reports. These other things, they're fairy tales. And this is what hurts the Zodiac case. All the Arthur Lee Allens and painting parties and all this nonsense. This is why this is an unsolved case, because people focus on the nonsense and not the meat and potatoes of the case. Yeah, all these other things, these esoteric suspects, they're mostly ridiculous. They're mostly, it's the police, the actual police were looking into George Waters. George Waters is a real suspect. George Waters is a real suspect who had a relationship with Darlene, harassed her. George Waters, other people besides Darlene's family confirm this. George himself confirms it. He tells, when he later speaks to the police. So George is a real suspect. These other things are true crime suspects. And let's make a distinction between true crime and I say real crime. And real crime is what the police investigate, and true crime is what they make documentaries on TV about. And they're not always the same thing. They're often vastly two very different things.
Well, I certainly haven't spoken favorably of the suspects that I just mentioned in the past, such as Arthur Lee Allen, Lawrence Kane, or William Joseph Grant. However, I guess I would say one thing in defense of these true crime suspects. Sometimes you'll find somebody who is conducting an independent investigation. They believe that they have the right person, and then they're trying to find supporting evidence because the police did not close the cases, or they're trying to get answers in the Zodiac Killer mystery the way that a lot of us are. And some of the people who are looking at these suspects were members of law enforcement. I mean, with William Joseph Grant, for example, Lyndon Lafferty was a member of law enforcement. Yeah. And more importantly, Les Lundblad thought very highly of William Joseph Grant as a suspect. And we're going to come back to him later on because I know you have a lot to say about him. But Harvey Hines, as well, who was looking at Lawrence Kane, and Arthur Lee Allen was the publicly named suspect of law enforcement. And I mean, I know you're saying that they're true crime suspects. A lot of armchair sleuths will attach themselves to these particular guys because they're plastered all over the internet. But sometimes these people have been given real consideration.
Yeah, and I think in certain regards, some of these people, even the names you mentioned, are pretty good suspects for one of the Zodiac murders or being adjacent to one of the Zodiac murders. But the problem is when you try to have, an Arthur Lee Allen for all of the Zodiac murders and then adjacent, non-canonical Zodiac crimes. Like when you try to say that, Arthur Lee Allen was the Lake Herman Road killer. Well, there's a confession in the Lake Herman Road. There's an informant who gives up the person. The local police, they believe they know who did Lake Herman Road. Les Lundblad doesn't think Lake Herman Road is Zodiac. He's the guy in charge. He thinks that, he actually thinks that John Holmberg, McGrath's buddy, did it because McGrath probably told Cunningham that John Holmberg was a shooter and he was just innocently sitting in the car. So, it's almost as if someone is linking a suspect to Lake Herman Road, it's almost a good way to eliminate that suspect.
And I don't mean to focus too much on Les Lundblad, but you do talk about him a lot in your book, and I would like to just ask you about this now. You mentioned something called Lundblad's razor. where you have, of course,
Yes.
Occam's razor, the statement that makes the fewest assumptions is most likely accurate. I mean, not everybody would say that's the definition of Occam's razor, but then you had Lundblad's razor, and would you like to tell us about that?
Well, it's one blood razor is sort of when you're presented with an overwhelming amount of evidence to the guilt of someone for a crime, you just do nothing, and that's it's not it's a knock on Les Lundblad. Yes, it is, and I'm not gonna I'm not gonna be shy about that. But it's also a knock on the system at the time where Les Lundblad could have known that and believed 100% that Dave McGrath and John Holmberg were the killers at Lake Herman Road, and that's his case. But in order for him to get anywhere further with that, he has to get his bosses and the district attorney to sign off on prosecuting that. So Les Lundblad was in court hearing people testify that Dave McGrath did the Matthew Burrell murder, and that was he. But he couldn't go any further with that because Dave McGrath is on death row, and the DA is just not going to charge McGrath for three other murders when he's already put him on death row in a very difficult trial, and it was the longest pretrial in the history of Solano County. It was a really difficult trial to get him on death row. They're not going to put him, on three more things. So Lundblad's razor, and it actually ties into Darlene, is sometimes you just do nothing. There's a fantastic another Darlene suspect, not George Waters, but a Solano deputy, the evidence officer and crime scene photographer named Chuck Lindsay. And in 71 or 72, Chuck Lindsay has a girlfriend over his home, and the girlfriend is shot with Chuck Lindsay's 357 Magnum in the abdomen and killed. And her children are in another room just a few feet away. And Chuck Lindsay tells the police that, oh, she shot herself, which is highly unlikely. That's not a way that women usually commit suicide within a few feet of their children. And the investigating officer on that case who accepted the suicide story was Les Lundblad.
Well, I can't really comment too much on that one because even though you do mention it in your book, I'm not extremely well informed on that one. However, if we're going to stay focused on Blue Rock Springs, now you said before we're going to talk about the suspects, we should talk about who Darlene Ferrin was, and we've also looked at George Waters as a suspect. But there are many other players that have been involved in the Blue Rock Springs shooting, and you talk about them in your book. And also, would you like to talk about some of the other possible suspects or criminals who may have had a connection to Blue Rock Springs?
Well, yeah, I mean, Darlene, it was stated by police officers that she dated three police officers at the time. One of those officers was Buzz Gordon. Buzz Gordon was fired for statutory rape accusations. She had a connection to him. They dated. Chuck Lindsay, who I spoke about with who has a connection to a woman killed with the 357 Magnum. Chuck Lindsay also he appears in Robert Graysmith's book as a suspect. His roommate apparently told Graysmith's researchers that Lindsay had photos of Darlene Ferrin, crime scene photos of Darlene Ferrin and other Zodiac victims up in his kitchen in his house, which is a pretty wild thing. Something else strange happens in this Vallejo investigation into Darlene's murder is that they don't speak to her ex-husband, Jim Phillips Crabtree, until February of 1970, which is, as you know, the police, the person they would like to talk to would be the current husband, stalker, and violent ex-husband. And Jim Phillips Crabtree, the police didn't bother looking for him until February of 70. And that's only after a psychic employed by Darlene's family mentions his name. And then the police, all these, 7, 8 months later, finally talk to this guy.
Now, if we're going to look at Jim Phillips Crabtree, there are a couple of things that I would like to say as well as ask you about him. And he more or less provided an alibi for the July 4th, 5th,
Yes.
1969 shooting of Darlene Ferrin. And if you watch the documentary, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, he is interviewed for it. And he says something to the effect of, no, I was in the woods and I was doing some LSD or something like that, doing drugs in the woods. And in your book, I think you provided a little bit more detail that he went to a campsite and then he got stuck at the campsite and he had to stay there for a while. But I mean, I would really like to just kind of ask you if you want to share any more info on that. And do you believe the alibi from Jim Phillips Crabtree?
I mean, it's possible. It's
Right.
he had a, a fairly detailed alibi about being at a concert at a hippie encampment, and his truck was broken down, and he couldn't get out of there. The police, when they went down to I think it was San Jose area to interview him, they Mullinex found him credible and said that we don't think that this guy, this is the guy. They kind of liked him as a dude. So yeah, I don't think Crabtree is the greatest of suspects, but I think it's very odd that they didn't make this determination until 1970. They should have, if this investigation was really focused on finding Darlene's murderer, they would have spoken to this man much earlier.
And it really is difficult because it's all just based on like somebody else vouching for his alibi, or do you just believe his story now that we're in the new millennium? And I mean, like, where were you on the night of the murder? Well, I was in the woods and I was doing drugs, and um, it's like that's not the best alibi in the world.
No,
It's not like somebody could was like, oh, I was at work and here are my time cards, and I was witnessed by all of
right?
these people, and here's the work that I did with my signature on it. I mean, it really is just coming down to whether or not you believe him or maybe some of the other people, maybe one person who vouched for him. And
Yeah,
I just have so many problems with that. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think he's the strongest suspect. And some
yeah, not
people,
at all.
okay, yeah,
I
right.
agree with you. I don't think he's the strongest suspect, and I don't think his alibi is that wonderful. But I think George Waters, who lived 25 minutes away in Yountville at the time of the Darlene's murder and was her stalker, was someone called the police and said that George Waters bragged about killing her at a strip club. He threatened to rape her. He broke into her apartment. He showed up at her work drunk every day. This is a guy who's out 7 days a week drinking and carousing and hanging out at strip clubs. Yet on July 4th, his alibi is that he's in bed by 11 p.m. with his wife after watching a fireworks show at the Home for Veterans in Yountville. And that's very strange because this guy, we know that this guy's a night owl and this guy's out every night of the week, and he's drinking and carousing and having affairs with women. But the one night, the biggest party night of the year, the 4th of July, when everyone's out partying, he's in bed by 11 supposedly, and his wife backs up the alibi. But it's later, and she posted on Tom Voigt's forum. It's later, revealed that she didn't know that it was a murder investigation, that it was a Zodiac murder investigation. She thought this had to do with the ex-wife's restraining order, and she vouched for him being home in bed at 11 o'clock. Not to say, and then she also said that George was abusive, terrorized her, and just was a pretty awful guy.
Would you say that George Waters is your top suspect for the Blue Rock Springs shooting?
Yes, I would say George Waters one, Chuck Lindsay further behind George Waters.
Now, this is going to tie into some very, very important stuff because I know that a lot of listeners to this program closely follow the Zodiac Killer mystery. And every Monday I talk about the Zodiac Killer here on Black Box Online Radio. As always, you guys can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these discussions, as well as write the show at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. But really, that begs the question of if you have these suspects, multiple killers for Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, then we have the Zodiac Killer letters starting after Blue Rock Springs, where somebody is stating some facts that only he and the police could know. And he's writing not only one, but multiple letters after Blue Rock Springs and before the future crimes at the time. How is that possible?
So there's something very interesting about George Waters, and that George Waters works at the Elks Lodge or the Elks Club, and he's an events bartender. So that means he works special events. And the special events at the Elks, at the Vallejo Elks and the Napa Elks at the time, and you can look back at this, it's police dinners, police award ceremonies, Boy Scouts things. So George Waters is the bartender at the organization that holds police events. And these policemen are members. Les Lundblad's a member. Terry Cunningham's a member. The Vallejo guys are members. The Napa police are members. Basically, every cop is a member of this Elks Club, and George Waters is the bartender.
Okay, so how do we get to the letters?
So if there's information in the letters,
Yes,
so
of course.
if we're trying to say that George Waters had any insider information, because I believe there's insider information in those letters. I believe the letters are things straight out of police reports in the original, the first three letters that went with the Zodiac cipher. I believe all that information is contained in the police reports. I think Thomas Horan noticed that, and I think he did a great job of noticing that. And so I guess just conjecture wise, if we're saying how, am I saying that George Waters is the letter writer? No, I'm not. But if he was the letter writer, how would he get the information? He is the bartender to a lot of local cops in the area. That's not the worst source of information.
But now, wait a second. This sounds almost like, okay, I guess you did say this at the beginning, that you are looking at how the person who killed Darlene Ferrin could have been the letter writer, which would mean that he obtained this information about Lake Herman Road while working as the bartender, and then he has info that only the police should know. So it's the killer, the police, and the bartender at the Elks Lodge, right? So then he can write this letter pretending to be, well, the first letter doesn't say anything. It just says, I am the murderer. And
Right.
then the second letter is the one that says, this is the Zodiac speaking. And do you think that George Waters wrote the first two letters or just one? What do you think?
I don't know. I don't know if he wrote any of the letters. I think it's somebody who's police adjacent that wrote those letters and is very has some understanding of police investigations. And I think that they tied the Lake Herman Road murder that Darlene's murderer couldn't have done to Darlene's murder in order to muddy the waters of the investigation. I think they know who's investigating this case. They have an understanding of that, and if they link these crimes together, like with the phone call on the 4th of July, if they link these crimes together, it will make them much harder to solve.
Okay, then, what is your take on the phone call? Because once again, to just kind of replay things, we have Darlene Ferrin and Mike Michaud in the car. They're shot sometime around 11:55 p.m., maybe 12 midnight, and then they are found, and a call comes in reporting it at 12:10. The police come. Darlene's pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m., and then at 12:40 a.m., somebody calls and says that they're responsible for the crime, and they also killed those two kids last year. Anything else you'd like to share about the phone call?
No, I have no reason to believe that the person who made that phone call was not the person who shot Darlene and Mike. I have reason to believe that they put the second part of that we killed the kids killed those kids last Christmas is a distraction. He's using that as a distraction by linking these crimes because he did not, because the person who killed the kids last Christmas had been in jail from June 3rd of 1969 until 1985. So he couldn't have been responsible for Darlene's murder, Darlene and Mike shooting, the phone call, or any of the letters. So the Lake Herman Road connection is no good. So I think this person is smart enough to know that if he links this crime to another crime, they'll have less of a chance of solving it.
And just to ask a question that I may have missed from your book. Now, originally you're talking about this guy's in jail. He was convicted and sentenced to death, right? Was he one of the people who had his sentence commuted to life in prison when California got rid of the death penalty, like the way the Manson family was? And then he was ultimately let out of jail in 85, or was it like a different situation?
Yeah, that's exactly it. In '72, California got rid of the death penalty, and Dave McGrath was was a model inmate. He was, he got a degree. He helped other prisoners. He was absolutely a model inmate, and he was released in '85 after it got changed to death, and then they released him.
Right, as I understand, only from looking at the Manson family case, all of the people who were sentenced to death in California had their sentences commuted to life in prison. And it sounds like David McGrath was one of them and then released in '85. But if I
Yeah.
can recap everything that you just said about the Blue Rock Springs phone call, that would be
Right.
hypothetically, this is all alleged, if it were George Waters who committed the Blue Rock Springs shooting, that he had been the bartender at the Elks Club. He's hearing the stories about the Lake Herman Road murders, and he would be under the impression that the person who murdered the two kids last year would not be convicted for it because he was already in jail. They're not going to have a trial again. So if he murdered Darlene Ferrin and made the phone call saying, I also killed those kids last year, that creates the distraction, the diversion. It's something that is going to take the focus off of him and put it on this kind of just serial killer illusion at the time, right? Because there is no Zodiac in July of 1969. There is no Zodiac yet. This person has not announced his debut to the world. So then that would bring us up to, I guess, the first letters. But first, did I follow everything you said? And that's kind of the hypothesis that you're outlining.
Yeah, and I think the same would apply for any of the other sort of dangerous men in Darlene's sphere, not just George Waters, but say like a Chuck Lindsay or or a Jim Crabtree. They were clever guys. They would have been able to, especially those two. They were very clever guys with Lindsay's law enforcement background, and you know Crabtree saying that he's an intel officer. He's a military guy. He's a clever guy too. He understands the system. So yeah. So whoever it was, I don't know who made this phone call or who it was, but any of these people are pretty good suspects and would have done that. Yes, I'm on with that.
So you have suspects for the Blue Rock Springs shooting as opposed to one suspect, singular, that you have finalized or that you're saying, absolutely, he's my go-to guy. There are possible contenders like George Waters, Chuck Lindsay, and Jim Phillips Crabtree.
Yeah, and I would say that Crabtree would be far behind the other two. I think Waters is a great suspect. I think Lindsay's a pretty good suspect. But unlike Lake Herman Road, no one confessed and put themselves at the scene. No informant came forward and told, and told that they know the guy who did it. There weren't number of people around Vallejo telling the police that so and so committed this crime. They didn't have a gun match. I mean, all the evidence that we had for Lake Herman Road, that doesn't apply for this one.
But this really is going to change the course of things because if it were just to end right there, I might say, okay, this is the end of the story. This is the end of the murder mystery. This is a completely plausible narrative. However, in August of 1969, somebody's going to write a letter that's going to say, this is the Zodiac speaking. And you've talked a little bit about the possible connections. You've said that this could be somebody who's law enforcement adjacent, but then what is going on in August of '69? If you had a drug related or gang related crime, the Vallejo thrill killers committing the Lake Herman Road murders, somebody murders Darlene Ferrin in some type of stalker or jealousy angle, then when you get to the letter, this is the Zodiac speaking, how does that fit in?
I mean, I'm not even sure it does. I'm not sure it has anything to do with uh, the murderer. I'm not sure that this isn't a kook writing a letter. I think Sergeant Terry Cunningham said when talking to the Crimes of the Century producer, he said that the four crime scenes are unlinked. The five murders are unlinked to each other. At the four crime scenes, and a kook, a nut, wrote the letters, taking credit for it. There's nothing in those letters that says that this person did it. Everything in those, the July 31st letters, is information that was in the police report. There's not a single bit of sort of specificity. There's no information that the letter writer gives that says I am definitely. It's not something that was not in the report. So maybe it's someone with access to the reports, but it certainly doesn't mean it's someone who did it.
But then what on earth could be the motivation for somebody to write letters taking credit for murders that they didn't commit?
I mean, lots of nut jobs write letters, taking credit for things they don't commit. Lots of basically, if a crime is a media case, there's people for whatever reason, and I'm not, whatever their issue is, are taking credit for it or they're confessing to it. There's false confessions all the time. There's when something gets in the media, like even like this Guthrie case right now, I'm sure they're fielding all kinds of wild tips from people who have nothing to do with the case just to insert themselves in this. So this could have nothing to do with this whatsoever.
Okay, so that's August 1969, the Zodiac Killer's debut. Then we get
Yes.
to Lake Berryessa in September of 69. Would you like to introduce that one for us?
Yeah. Okay. So it's another couple. It's a couple that used to date, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. They're college students. They're Seventh-day Adventists. They're having a picnic in at Lake Berryessa, which is in Napa County. Which earlier in that day they were in St. Helena at a flea market. At the time, interestingly enough, George Waters lives in St. Helena. That's neither here nor there, but he lives in the same town. And this case is a lot different, and because there's a surviving witness in this. Cecilia is murdered, and Brian lives. So this is the canonical Zodiac crime, but there's a lot of differences between the other ones. This is the crime where the man is wearing the costume, the hood, the famous Zodiac hood with the Zodiac symbol, the Celtic cross or whatever it is, the gun sight symbol. This is a different type of Zodiac crime because the Lake Berryessa Zodiac, as opposed to the Blue Rock Springs Zodiac, he ties the victims up. The Blue Rock Springs Zodiac, it was a blitz attack. He shot them in a car. This one ties them up and sits with them for, Brian Hartnell estimated, 15 minutes talking. He's having nervous conversation for 15 minutes while talking to these people. This happens in during daylight hours in Napa County. It's not in Solano County. The guy's wearing a costume. He stabs them. He murders them with a knife. So it's, instead of, it's a much different MO. He stabs them both multiple times. Brian Hartnell described the man as being between 225 and 250 pounds, which in 1969 is a tremendously large man. George Foreman is the heavyweight champion of the world, and everybody talks about how big George Foreman is, and I think he's 222 pounds. So this man is bigger than Ali. He's bigger than Foreman. He's bigger than Joe Frazier. He's about the size of a NFL lineman. The man that Mike Mageau didn't get a great look at this. He was shot in the face, and the guy was shining a flashlight in his face. But Mike Mageau described a short man, 5'8", with curly brown, almost blonde hair, 26 to 30 years old, and about 190 to 200 pounds. So this man is significantly larger. The Blue Rock Springs attacker is significantly larger, but in commonality, the Lake Berryessa attacker is significantly larger. But something in common is this person makes a phone call, calls the police, and confesses to a double murder. But then something else that's different is, instead of sending a letter, he writes on Brian Hartnell's car door, and he links it. He uses the dates. He writes Vallejo and writes the date of the Lake Herman Road murder, the Blue Rock Springs murder, and then the date of the Lake Berryessa murder and the time, 6:30, and he puts that on the car door. So that's different. That's almost like we're dealing with something a little bit kind of a mashup of Zodiac and the Tate LaBianca murders that happened in L.A. Now, remember, this is now September of '69. So we have the Sharon Tate, the murders at her house, where it's like these spooky murders. Later it's the Manson family that did it, but it's like these spooky murders. There's writing on the wall. There's stabbings, and this is a stabbing, and there's writing on Brian Hartnell's car door. It doesn't say political piggy or the things that helter skelter and the things that the Manson family said, but it's kind of a combination, of the Zodiac murders in the San Francisco area and these LA murders the Manson family did. So this immediately looks like a copycat.
So a copycat who was closely following the Tate LaBianca murders threw in some inspirations from the TLB murders into this Lake Berryessa stabbing, and this person was totally unrelated and unconnected to Blue Rock Springs and Lake Herman Road. Did I get you right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing that makes the most sense, and the way this gets, the way this becomes a canonical Zodiac crime is absurd. Sherwood Morrow comes in, and he's a document examiner, and this is now in 2026. It's easy to look back and say that like handwriting analysis is pseudoscience, it's junk science, it's not necessarily something we believe as great forensic evidence now. But in 69, this was something people believed in. But the earlier letters that were sent to the newspapers, the August 4th and the July 31st letters, were written on paper with a blue felt tip pen. The writing on Brian Hartnell's car door is in black, and it's on a car door instead of paper. So it's under the best of circumstances, and with the evolution of the field, it's difficult/impossible to compare writing on paper to writing on a car door. It's apples to oranges, but Sherwood Morrow doesn't care about that. He compares apples to oranges, and he comes up with Zodiac, and he makes this a canonical crime. And this thing that looks nothing like the other ones is all of a sudden part of Zodiac canon.
Now, there is another book out there called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer by Thomas Hoare, and we've mentioned it once or twice, and I'm going to ask you some questions about that one later on. But his analysis of this quote-unquote copycat theory was that the Zodiac's letters and the symbol were published in the paper, and if this were a copycat, this person had at least 5 weeks to practice their handwriting to make it look similar. And also, the explanation for the blue to black switch was that when the writing of the Zodiac was published in the paper, it was black, not blue. And it wasn't even trying to be black and white. It's just that when the letters were photographed, they came out in black because of it's called the lithographic camera. I forget, it's been a long time since I've read his book, but the camera immediately changed the color of the ink to black. So if somebody were to read that in the paper, they would be like, oh, hey, look, this person is writing in black ink. Their brain would probably just immediately accept that it's black. They wouldn't even think about to use a blue felt tip pen. Do you think he was on point with that?
Yeah, I think he noticed. I think he was. Yeah, he was pretty sharp with that. I think that's astute analysis.
Now, there are other things we can talk about, but only because I brought it up. Maybe I'm derailing too much. But Thomas Horn did write The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. And I've already said the term Zodiac hoax theory multiple times. He has been the largest proponent of the Zodiac hoax theory. And it's the idea that sounds quite similar to what you're saying, although you have a few differences. And I would really like to know, how big of an influence was Thomas Horan on you? And where do you think he was right? Where do you think he was wrong? I know you brought up a few examples already about where you agree with him, but like, what is your take on the book and documentary, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer?
Well, yeah, I definitely find his work influential. There's a number of people who have, I've read all the Zodiac books, and I think even like, you mentioned Lyndon Lafferty before. I think even from the worst books, I think you once called it the worst ever Zodiac book. I think there are things you can learn from that, and I think Haran, with his role as a writing professor and dealing with students, I think he was uniquely able to look at the Zodiac letters and look at the police reports and see that there was plagiarism from the, basically things copied right out of the reports and put into the letters. And then what I think the Zodiac inverts, the Zodiac letter writer inverts some phrases, like a kid, copying their friend's homework and changing a couple of things. He inverts some things, like, and just to make it look different, but he's saying the same thing. So I think Haran was astute with that. And I think Haran also noticed something about how the voice of the letters changed. And it's something that it's occurred to me for a long time too. It's something that bothered me, is that the say the first three letters, the code killer letters from July 31st, they're just the facts. But then you get to the 1970s letters, and Zodiac is asking people to wear a button and some goofy things like that. And he's doing a review of the movie The Exorcist, about what a great satirical comedy. And he's quoting or misquoting the Mikado. And there's like all this goofy stuff. He's talking, the voice of the letter writer had changed dramatically. The 1969 letter writer and the letter writer from, some point on in the 70s sounds like a different writer.
Okay, but you did say that I called Lyndon Lafferty's book, The Zodiac Killer Cover Up, the worst Zodiac book ever, and I did say that in the past, but do I think that now? No, I don't. Because I would say the worst Zodiac book that I've ever read was Zodiac Killer Civilian Sleuths by Jordan Chase, and I have episodes about Lyndon Lafferty's book and Jordan Chase's book here. That one gets that title because I don't know if it was AI written or computer generated, or it was actually just sloppily created. He lost almost all credibility with me once he said that the car door at Lake Berryessa that we've just been discussing only said 12/20/68, like the Zodiac symbol, and then 12/20/68, but none of the other dates. Then that kind of was just the nail in the coffin when I had to be like, all right, this doesn't seem like a human being who has assembled this.
Yeah.
Very odd sentences.
Yeah, I'm a regular listener to your show, and you didn't seem too pleased with that. But even Lafferty's book, and I don't think the world of Lafferty's book, but he did, he did an investigation. He had investigators working on it. They did come up with some information, and he did have this notion that Les Lundblad was sort of like told to back off on the case, and I think there's some, that's worth looking at.
Well, we have to remember, though, that Les Lundblad did have his own suspect. In Lafferty's suspect were one and the same, and that was William Joseph Grant. And I had the opportunity to correspond with a family member of Les Lundblad once, and I'm like, what do you make of these things that Lafferty was saying that until his dying days, Les Lundblad believed that William Joseph Grant was the Zodiac killer? And that family member said, yeah, that was all true. He really thought that William Joseph Grant was the Zodiac. So, I mean, he had his suspect. And as I say very frequently on this channel, not all members of law enforcement are going to agree on everything. Sure. I mean, you look at, some people are trying to vilify Arthur Lee Allen. Harvey Hines, whom I already mentioned, had Lawrence Kane as his suspect. And you're also going to have different members of law enforcement. Like you have Les Lundblad, who is the detective working the Lake Herman Road case. Okay, he is right, on the battlefield. Then you have Lyndon Lafferty, who was a highway patrolman who was kind of just observing this guy named William Joseph Grant do some weird things, and he really got bothered by him. He didn't like the way he was looking at him. It's almost like he was driving his car from one side of the road to the other, and Lafferty wasn't sure why. Well, let me look into this guy. So that's just kind of being bothered by a creepy feeling. I don't like that.
No, it's absurd. It's homophobia. William Grant was a bisexual man who cruised parking lots and, rest areas in search of gay sex sometimes. And I think that they were, revolted by that. And this is, again, the 60s. People have different opinions, and they were revolted by that. And they unfairly sort of looked at this Grant, as a suspect. But I think what's important was, if Les Lundblad's Zodiac suspect was Grant, I believe that. I absolutely believe that. I think Les Lundblad believes his own case is not Zodiac, and I think I want to draw attention to the book Shooting Zodiac by Robert Graysmith, which I actually made a mistake in my own book, and I called it Zodiac Unmasked, but it's Shooting Zodiac, the Graysmith book, where he has Fincher and Bauer and Conway and some of the officers who worked the case talking about the case, and they're talking about how they believe that Fincher even says this, that the Lake Herman Road murders, and they say McGrath and his partner, Bauer, Conway, and Fincher are talking about McGrath and his partner being psychopaths, and they think it was the Blue Rock Springs murderer was inspired by the Lake Herman Road. The Zodiac, being the Blue Rock Springs murder, was inspired by the Lake Herman Road murders that Dave McGrath and his partner did. So, Graysmith, even though Graysmith, the story we believe today is largely, due to newspaper accounts in the 60s and 70s and Robert Graysmith's book Zodiac, which was then adapted into Fincher's film Zodiac. I have to, give credit to Graysmith for putting out the book Shooting Zodiac and letting knowledgeable people who investigated the case, or a filmmaker who had a team of investigators, looking and researchers looking into the case. He has them talking about Dave McGrath doing Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs being the Zodiac, and the Zodiac being inspired by the McGrath murder. So, yeah, I think people like pile on Robert Graysmith a lot, but I think that was in terms of adding new Zodiac information, he did that in recent years with Shooting Zodiac, which is a good book.
But I do want to be clear about one thing, just for my own personal notes. The reason why I said I didn't like Lyndon Lafferty's book was not because he talks about William Joseph Grant as a suspect. And I also want to be clear that even though I think it's an impractical method to solve a murder mystery about, just seeing some guy on the side of the highway and he looked at you in a way that you didn't like, so then therefore you have to think that this guy is a serial killer. It's not that at all. I mean, I think those methods are impractical, but the real reason is because he blatantly fabricated and printed false information in his book, The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up, most notably when he said that the disappearance of Donna Lass occurred on September 26th of 1970 to commemorate the 13-month anniversary of the Lake Berryessa stabbing, which is all just blatantly false. Donna Lass went missing on September 6th of 1970. 20 days before that. And that's just one example. I did a 2-part book discussion on Lyndon Lafferty's book, and he has multiple things in there. And he was also criticized by other people by saying that, hey, how could, Lafferty recreate conversations with people when he wasn't present or privy to the information in those conversations. And there is a section in his book that openly states that this chapter is a fictionalization and so on. But then at the same time, he's trying to use that information and act like he solved the Zodiac Killer case. End of my complaint. But
No, it's I just want to say the only thing worse, I've read the book. I try to be a completist. I try to read everything. If I'm writing a book about this, I try to read everyone's book. And yeah, I have lots of issues with that book, and it was really expensive too. I spent like $45 on it, getting it. I have lots of problems with it, but the only thing worse than the book was the documentary made about it. Was it Zodiac Killer Project?
Well, you see, I didn't watch that one yet. I guess it'll be available on streaming services soon, although it is in book format now, so I might just read the book instead of watching that one. But I actually had a chance to talk to you about it a little bit, and other people saw
Yeah.
it and they provided their feedback, and they said it was mostly just like someone telling the story of what it would be like if he had made a movie, like the drama, about the book The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up.
Yeah, it's a tough watch. It's about what would have happened if he got the option to Lafferty's book and the movie he would have made. And it's a lot of voiceovers and just like shots of Vallejo and yeah, voiceovers of what would have been happening. And it's basically a send up of the, true crime documentaries.
Okay, though, so to get back on track with our timeline, we've
Sorry.
gone through no, this is on me. I'm the one who kind of likes to talk about different stuff. That we've gone through Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa. We've also talked about the phone calls and the letters. Now we're going to the murder of Paul Stein on October 11th of 1969. And as I understand, you have a pretty clear analysis on what you think happened.
Yeah, this is absolutely yeah, this is the weirdest thing in the Zodiac case. I think I think so much harm was done to the other murders that were associated with the Paul Stein murder when this all became a Zodiac crime. When they all were lumped under the same umbrella. I think, yeah, this. Okay, so let me try to be impartial here. So this one takes place. How this one is different. The Presidio Heights Zodiac um, strikes in a wealthy neighborhood in a big city. He's in San Francisco. He's not at a lover's lane in the North Bay or at a recreation area. He's in a big city. He shoots Paul Stein in the head, but he also robs Paul Stein. None of the other victims were robbed. Brian Hartnell offered to write a check. He threw his car keys. The guy, his killer didn't even take his car keys. Paul Stein, he is robbed. Um, the victimology is different. It's a solo man. It's a 29-year-old man. The others were all attacks on couples. And there's something really there's a few other interesting things that are happening at the time that in Presidio Heights, where the murder happens, which is a very wealthy area of San Francisco, there was a serial cab bandit robbing cab drivers at gunpoint. And just 11 days before the Paul Stein robbery and murder, another cab driver named Paul Hom picks up a passenger at a hotel. The guy has to be dropped in Presidio Heights. The guy then changes his mind and says, "Please take me to the Presidio. I have to pick up a car." The passenger is sitting in the front seat. He pulls out a gun, robs Paul Hom, and he puts Paul Hom in the trunk of his car. So there's activity that is mirroring Paul Stein's murder that's happening in the area. There are no witnesses to Paul Stein's murder. That's a people speak about the Robbins kids being murder witnesses as if it's a fact. They did not witness a murder, and they did not even hear a gunshot. They looked out the window and they saw a man propping up Paul Stein's body in his cab and possibly going through his pockets. And then that man took what may have been a rag and wiped down the cab. But I think it's a very important distinction. Now, likely, yes, that's likely the person, but I think you can't say it is the murderer because they didn't witness a murder. And that man could be anybody. That could be a good Samaritan trying to help. That could be a thief trying to, roll a dead man. And like if you talk to any sort of police who've worked in cities or big cities, that's not the furthest thing. It's not out of the realm of possibilities that this person could have been one of those people. So there's a cab back. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue. Tell us more about Paul Hom.
Yeah, so Hom is robbed 11 days earlier, and immediately the crimes are linked. Dave Toschi catches the Paul Stein murder, and the San Francisco police had sent a patrol officer to speak to the witnesses and get a description and make a sketch about that. Toschi has a sketch sent to cab companies because they're looking for a cab bandit, and that all changes 2 days later when a Zodiac letter shows up at the Chronicle with a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. And the letter is, from the Zodiac saying that I'm the killer of the cab driver, and that sort of takes away the cab robber thing, and now it becomes a Zodiac crime.
But did I hear you correctly when you said that they arrested the murderer of Paul Stein, or did you mean Paul Hom?
Oh no, I don't think I said either of those things.
Oh, okay. So I guess we'll kind of get to the point and just ask who do you think committed the Stein murder?
I think a man named Robert Brommel. He there's a murder. Robert Brommel. Okay, so Paul Stein picked up his killer on Mason and Geary. Robert Brommel lives at 610 Geary, which is a block and a half away. Robert Brommel in January of 1970 in Presidio Heights robs a cab driver named Charles Jarman at gunpoint. He shoots Charles Jarman and kills him. Dave Toschi catches the Charles Jarman murder case, and the newspapers immediately think that Zodiac had committed another murder in January of 70. This actually makes the LA Times front page, which is a tremendous deal. The LA Times is the paper of record for the West Coast. It's a tremendous deal that they think that there's this other Zodiac murder that happens in January of 70. And Dave Toschi says a very strange thing when asked, is this guy the Zodiac? Dave Toschi says something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing. He says, well, this person didn't cut the cab driver's shirt, and we know that the Zodiac cuts the cab driver's shirt, which is a strange thing, because if the Zodiac is supposed to be the person who had committed all these other murders in the North Bay and in Napa, there wasn't shirt cutting involved in that. So that's a really odd thing for Toschi to say. But this Brommel confesses rather quickly to Toschi and Armstrong that he had killed Charles Jarman. He starts out by saying that it was an accident, the gun accidentally went off, and then a few minutes later he's saying, yeah, I shot that son of a bitch and I meant it. Toschi and Armstrong get him to confess. He pleads guilty and doesn't have to testify, doesn't have to go to court, doesn't have to be a trial. He is in prison and until the 1980s, also early 1990s also.
Okay, though, but then what on earth is the shirt piece doing in the Zodiac's letter if it's just this cab thief, this robber? What on earth is this, very detailed letter about the Stein murder doing showing up with a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt?
Yeah, it's the bloody shirt's a very strange thing, because if you look at the content of the two letters that it was sent to, not the Belli letter, but the two letters to the Chronicle that Paul Stein's shirt was with, both of those letters have details that indicate that the letter writer was somehow on scene. The letter writer is talking about different police units that responded, how they responded with a fire department spotlight, how they responded with a canine unit, how they responded with motorcycles. It's almost like he's giving a breakdown of the police tactics that failed to catch Paul Stein's shooter. There's a really strange thing going on there. And it seems that this person, in order to witness all of this, would have to be either on scene or right near the scene. Now, this is supposedly a man who, you would imagine would be fleeing from the police. There's a gigantic police response. There's dozens of patrol cars, dozens of officers, specialized units. They're all on the scene and fanning out into the area searching for this. Yet we're supposed to believe that this guy, this letter writer, if he's Paul Stein's shooter, may have blood all over him from the shooting, and he's carrying a large swath of Paul Stein's shirt. And we're supposed to believe that this person is standing around in plain view and not caught by the police. I don't know what's going on with this shirt, but I know that there's no record, and I think this may come from Haran too. There's no record in any reports filed prior to the letter arriving with Paul Stein's shirt that there's anything wrong with Paul Stein's shirt. And I believe that the medical examiner as part of the coroner goes through the clothes as part of the exam, and they found $4.33 in change in Paul Stein's clothing, but they don't note in the report that there's anything suspicious about the shirt, where a large rectangle would have been cut out of the shirt. So there's something very strange happening here.
But you must know that there's the skeptical alternative. I shouldn't even call it skeptical alternative. Let's call it the mainstream view. And that is that, yes, a rectangle was missing from the back of Paul Stein's shirt. But when the authorities arrived and the paramedics arrived, detectives, and perhaps even the coroner, they were more focused on the fact that Paul Stein was murdered, he had been shot in the head, and they weren't too concerned with a shirt missing a rectangular piece of fabric. And it was just, something that definitely did not cross anybody's mind because they had duties to do, they had duties to perform, and that was just something that was not a priority for them. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, yeah, I think in certain cases, yes, like the ambulance attendants, they wouldn't pass any remarks on that, and maybe the police on scene wouldn't pass any remarks on that. But the coroner's job, as part of the post mortem, is to carefully examine the deceased clothing, and they did. They carefully examined it so much so that they found change in it that added up to $4 and something cents that Armand Palisetti didn't know about when he wrote the report. So they did a careful examination of they did look at the clothing. They did look, and they didn't say anything about the shirt being cut or the shirt having a rectangle cut out of it. It's just,
Does this
it's God.
does this mean that you believe that the rectangular piece of Paul Stein's shirt was taken from either the morgue or the crime lab?
It may have.
And is there any like scenario that you can give us, like a play-by-play about what you think happened, going from Paul Stein's shirt being logged into evidence or taken off, or from the morgue to the piece of shirt ending up in the envelope being mailed in? And let's be clear, multiple segments of the shirt were mailed in with Zodiac correspondences.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to elaborate too much on this because I know you have written your book. You perhaps want to let the readers find things for themselves. But what do you think happened?
Um, Precisely, I don't know what happened, but something I will say that is if Zodiac were caught, and if Zodiac were caught in, say, 1980, would San Francisco even be able to get an indictment against Zodiac with knowledge that this shirt these shirt anomalies happened, and then knowledge that, and we spoke about this the last time I was on the show, and I've only learned a lot more about it, and it's you could write 5 books about it. I hope somebody else does it. Take the information I have, run with it. Dave Toschi, uh, being the lead investigator, he was a complicated person. He was a very sharp police officer, but in order to preserve this Zodiac case and to keep himself in the paper, he planted stories in the newspaper. He wrote letters to different newspaper columnists praising himself by name. There were fake stories in Guy Wright's column, multiple fake stories in Guy Wright's column involving Dave Toschi doing police heroics with people that don't exist in crimes that didn't happen. Dave Toschi then has the Amistad Maupin scandal, where he is featured in Amistad Maupin's column and writes fan letters purportedly from college women and young women talking about how they want more Dave Toschi in the column. And Dave Toschi is ultimately, by his own department, the San Francisco police, he is accused of writing 2 Zodiac letters and investigated for writing those letters. At the culmination of that investigation, where he's exonerated by his own co-workers and bosses in a police investigation, which is largely self-serving, he is then put on a punishment assignment, demoted to the pawn shop detail. So he went from the top detective in San Francisco, the top murder cop, to working a detail where he's doing grunt work of matching stolen items to pawn shop tickets. He's called a disturbed personality with a need for publicity by his chief Gain. Chief Gain, after, and this is very disturbing. After Chief Gain tells the world that disturbed personality Toschi didn't write the fake 1978 letter, he then tells the FBI that Toschi wrote 3 letters, and then he makes a request of the FBI lab. And this is actually very shocking, and not enough people talk about this. Chief Gain writes to the FBI to compare every letter from the first Paul Stein shirt letter until the fake 1978 "I'm back, City Pig Toschi" letter. and asked the FBI to determine if the same person wrote all those letters. So just to be very clear, the chief of the San Francisco police, upon asked the FBI to see if the letter that he believed his officer, the fake letter he believed his officer wrote, was the same, if that was the same writer as all the letters beginning with the first Paul Stein letter. And that's in the FBI report. You don't have to trust me on this. You go to the vault, look it up. That happened. There's 3 instances where Toschi is named as in the FBI report as a writer of fake Zodiac letters for publicity. You don't have to believe me. It's in the FBI report. And this is very problematic because to put this in front of a jury where there's a man accused of, and, people de facto admitting he did it, manufacturing evidence or writing self-aggrandizing letters about himself in a case that's only held together by letters that were authenticated by Sherwood Morrill. The only reason these Zodiac cases are together, Sherwood Morrill authenticated the letters. Then Chief Gain is now asking an outside agency, outside expert, to determine whether Toschi had written all these letters. And that is wild, and not enough people talk about this.
All right, on that note, I want to ask you very directly, and I know we've shared some of this in your previous appearances, but do you believe that Dave Toschi wrote multiple Zodiac letters? Do you believe he actually did
Yes.
it?
Yes,
And
multiple.
which letters would those be?
The 78 one, obviously, the I'm Back, City Pig Toschi. I think Toschi is a good fit for the 86 and 87 letters that are non-authenticated letters, but they are Zodiac letters, and they have Toschi written all over them. And there's a few earlier letters. I want to say that if you look at the LA Times letter, there's a few hallmarks of Toschi in there. The letter writer congratulates the police on discovering the link in Riverside. And while it was initially Riverside police contacting Napa in 69, by 71, it's a tip supposedly from a civilian given to Paul Avery, a newspaper reporter, who made the connection. So the connection, as far as someone would know, a civilian would know, would be a civilian giving it to a newspaper reporter. So this would come from a newspaper reporter. Yet the LA Times letter credits the police for their great work. Whenever there's someone crediting the police for great work, and you can look at this, it's all over. There's 2 chapters about Toschi, and it's the letters to the San Francisco Examiner, and it's all congratulations, all police congratulations things, and there's a little bit of that in the LA Times letter.
And when you say the LA Times letter, do you mean the March 13th, 1971 letter that was mailed from Pleasanton, California, that mentions the Riverside activity?
Yep, let me take my headphones out. Can you hear me?
Hello? Yes, I can.
Yes, Ned.
When you say
Hi.
the when you say the LA Times letter, do you mean the March 13th, 1971 letter that mentions the Riverside activity?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I have the text right here. I just pulled it up. And it says, "This is the Zodiac speaking. Like I have always said, I am crack proof. If the blue meanies are ever going to catch me, they had best get off their fat asses and do something, because the longer they fiddle and fart around, the more slaves I will collect for my afterlife. I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there. The reason I'm writing to the Times is they don't bury me on the back pages like some of the others. SFPD 0, Zodiac 17 plus." And, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot right now, but what exactly about that makes you think that Dave Toschi would have written that letter?
The police. He gives credit to the police for discovering his activities down there. There's a concern about front page. These are just Toschi hallmarks, and you've read the book. There's his letters to the Examiner have a lot of hallmarks about giving credit to the police. And I just think, yeah, I think the Riverside police are not totally convinced that that letter's legitimate. The Riverside police, when they gave the cold case unit, when they gave a statement, I think it was 2021 or 2022, they took a shot at Toski in that statement.
And we've talked about the letters now from 1971, 78, 86, and 87. But what do you think about the 1974 letters, starting with the Exorcist letter? And of course, you can also mention the SLA letter, Badlands card, Count Marco letter, if you want. But firstly, what do you think about the 1974 letters in relation to Dave Toski, or maybe their authenticity coming from somebody else, Zodiac related? What do you think?
Well, Dave Toski was investigated simultaneously for the 1978 I'm Back letter, City Pig Toski, and the Exorcist letter. So, and the Exorcist letter does not sound like the earlier Zodiac letters. Then there's the whole thing about, in Mike Rodelli's book about Alan Keel and how he related the two together. So that's, I think there's something there.
And what you're talking about is that there might actually be DNA on the Exorcist letter and the 1978 letter, and those two letters could be linked via DNA, meaning they were written by the same person. And Mike Rodelli believes that, and he has reasons for that. Like, he has reasons why he believes that Alan Keel made that determination. Did I follow you?
Yeah.
So that would mean that they were mostly unrelated. But overall, though, um, Eddie, as we approach the final segments of this interview, I would like to ask, how has your message been received? How have you felt interacting with other Zodiac researchers? What has been the response so far when you talk about this variant of, like, the myth of the Zodiac Killer or the Zodiac hoax theory? And some people even call it the Zodiac Killer fraud. That's what Evan from Texas said. It should be the Zodiac Killer fraud, not the Zodiac Killer hoax. But how have people responded to your observations?
Well, I think it's more of the Zodiac Killer fandom, and I'm talking about that. So it depends on the person. Some people have told me that they read the book in one shot, they couldn't put it down, and immediately they went to, I think I have 120 references that from articles, and I provide receipts for the work I'm doing, and they got a newspapers.com account to start looking up the things that I was referencing and the cases I was referencing. So I think a lot of people found it to be very interesting and compelling work, and they were on board with me, and they so much so that they were looking up the other articles. I think there's another group who are very attached to the Zodiac story, and that's what this is. It's a great story, the Zodiac story, and I think a lot of people at 12 years old discovered the Zodiac story, whether it's through Graysmith's book or the Geraldo Rivera or Unsolved Mysteries or a TV show or the newspapers at the time or Fincher's movie or one of the many documentaries. And it's a spooky story. It's a compelling story. They're attached to the story. And what my work is doing is saying that story that they love and they care about, and they may have spent a large part of their adult life, dealing with, is invalid. And I understand why they're reluctant. I think there are people who are absolutely reluctant to interact with my work because it basically it says Santa Claus isn't real. It's telling a professional wrestling fan that the matches are scripted, and then they're looking for, when is it really a shoot instead of a work? When is this real between, a Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik really didn't like each other at this instance, and this might be the real part. So there is a pushback from people who are part of the Zodiac fandom. I think that they don't want to interact with this material because it's going to ruin something special for them.
But it sounds like a summary or a recap of the observations that you've made throughout the duration of this interview would be that, number one, there were different killers for the Zodiac crimes, and it sounds like you have said that for the canonical crimes, there was a different killer every time, and that it's almost as if this thing starts out as a creation of somebody who may have been responsible for the Blue Rock Springs shooting, who was trying to create a diversion. But then, by the summer of 69, by the end of the summer of 1969, that is, it seems like that diversion was hijacked and the story was shared and misrepresented by other people. Firstly, maybe the letter writer, secondarily, the Lake Berryessa copycat, and then the letters would continue. And of course, the Stein murder may have been, well, it's unconnected in your opinion, but then somebody wrote a letter taking credit for it. And there are, I mean, so many questions I can continue to ask you. And I know you've kind of put forward some of them already, but did I understand everything that you said? Is there anything you would like to add to my summary of what you have shared?
Well, I think you did a good job of summarizing it. I think the way I look at it is it was a pre-internet sort of copy pasta where, different people, formed a legend. It was the Slender Man. It was an urban legend. It was like Slender Man pre-internet, where a bunch of different people contributed their own sort of fiction to the narrative, and the narrative was, it's a very compelling, very seductive narrative, and it draws a lot of people in, including myself. I've read every Zodiac book. I've seen the movie, multiple times. I've watched every documentary. I listen every Monday to your show. It's a very seductive story. But I do think, yeah, it's a pre-internet sort of copy pasta. It's Slender Man for the hippie era.
But if we're going to look at this as a copy pasta, I think we can go beyond what I said in the summary. Firstly, it would be that there was a group of thrill killers who were committing a lot of crimes in 1968, and one of them happened to be the Lake Herman Road murders. Then somebody launched a plan to murder Darlene Ferrin, and they wanted to create a distraction by saying, I also killed those kids last year. And if your suspect is George Waters for that, then he would have obtained that information by bartending at the Elk Lodge, and he knew, and no matter whom your suspect is, they knew that the person who committed the Lake Herman Road murders would not be arrested because they were already in jail for something else. They were already going to be sentenced to death. They were going to get the death penalty at the time. So they knew that no one was going to be arrested for it. Therefore, they could say, I also killed those kids last year. And somebody could even take that and write it in a letter, do something more expansive and say, here are the details, here are the facts that only I and the police know, stealing stuff from police reports. Because once again, they knew that there would not be an arrest in the Lake Herman Road murders. And if you connect it to Blue Rock Springs, then also this would be something where it's not going to be busted, because one of the biggest challenges to the hoax theory is that, well, if there were separate criminals in every crime, what would happen if somebody were arrested? Wouldn't that just kind of expose everything? And I kind of admit that it is, but with Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, I think there's some explanations as to why that wouldn't happen. Now with Lake Berryessa, I don't know what you would think, but I would think if you're going to entertain a multiple killers theory or a hoax theory, then that if that were a copycat completely, then in the quote unquote Zodiac letter writer would just say, whatever. No, I didn't do that. I never claimed that. And end of discussion, right? I mean, that was just somebody pretending to be me. And then once you get to the Stein murder, as you've already said, it seems like there is some type of either insider law enforcement job, or the fact that somebody is writing the letter with a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt that would most likely exonerate any type of kind of cab thief, because then couldn't you just say, no, I didn't do that, I didn't cut off a piece of his bloody shirt and mail it in with a letter. This person who claimed the other crimes mailed in the piece of the bloody shirt. There's your killer. I have alibis on December 20th of 68 and July 4th of 69. So it does sound like there's some interconnected things, but I don't know. What do you think about everything that I just said?
Yeah, I think I think we made the connections afterwards. I think at the time, um, very little of this was probably forethought to be interconnected. I think one instance where I believe the Blue Rock Springs murderer certainly was trying to attach his crime to the Lake Herman Road murders. I think that was intentional, and that was to cause a distraction. You know, I don't know what would motivate, you know, I think that's a motivation that we understand. I don't know what would motivate someone to, you know, attack two young people, stab them, and then try to make it look like a Manson Zodiac mashup. I don't know what type of, you know, forethought was put into that, but obviously some forethought was, because the guy showed up with a costume and he showed up with multiple weapons and he showed up with, you know, cut pieces of clothesline to tie them up with. So, uh, and then the Stein murder, you know, it's so crazy. It's, you know, it's so different. It's, you know, it's yeah, I mean, I feel like the ultimately what happened is, you know, I don't think it was all planned out. Like, these things certainly weren't all planned out by one person. I think it was, you know, a circumstance and I think it's like crass opportunism. I used that phrase in the book, I think, and I think that applies to a lot of these things. I think there was a lot of opportunism in the Zodiac investigation, to keep it in the newspaper, to keep it on the front page, to keep the story of good versus evil, super cop versus super villain in that narrative going. And I think that's what drove the story. That's why we're still talking about the story. I think every serial killer entertainment movie, from, you know, Long Legs to, you know, the Silence of the Lambs, there's a Zodiac influence. The toying with the police, and you know, I think that's, you know, that was developing in real time. I don't think it was, you know, thought out beforehand.
Okay, though. So, do you mind if I ask you some questions about the likelihood or probability of the suspects in the crimes that
Sure.
you've mentioned? How certain
Okay. Yeah.
are you? How certain are you that the Lake Herman Road murders were committed by the Vallejo thrill killers?
Like 100% certain. I can't say who the trigger man was exactly, but a member of I believe two members of that group did that one. Yeah, that's like 95% certain. You know, like that's, yeah.
Okay, so you said 99 or 100% certain for the Vallejo
Yeah,
thrill
and
killers.
like, it's not just me saying that. Like, you know, the original investigators, you know, they believe that. You know, the cold case investigators believe that. You know, people in years. So this is, yeah, this, you know, Lake Herman Road is, you know, that's by far the most certain one.
Okay, how certain are you that George Waters murdered Darlene Ferrin?
I think he's the best suspect. So I think he's the best suspect as Darlene's killer. You know, being that he's a stalker, he threatened her, he threatened to rape her, he supposedly bragged about killing her. I think he's a very good suspect. You know, at least 51%.
Okay, 51%. And that would mean that he also made the phone call, correct?
Yeah, I see no reason to believe that the phone call was made by anyone other than the killer.
And then once we get to the letters, like the debut letter, the August 4th letter, I think you stated that, that was not George Waters. That was a member of law enforcement who had access to the police reports. Did I understand that right? Or
Yeah, I don't know. I know it's someone,
right.
you know, I don't know who did it. I don't know who wrote it, but I know that the person who wrote it has access to some insider law enforcement information. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is a cop. They could be a friend of a cop. They could be someone who interacted with these reports. They could be, you know, an administrative person. They could be, you know, a relative of someone. It's just someone who knows what's in the police reports.
So then, next question. How certain are you that Lake Berryessa was a copycat, meaning the person who did not commit Blue Rock Springs and Lake Herman Road?
I'm 100% certain that the person who did the Lake Berryessa murder did not do the Lake Herman Road murder. And it's likely, you know, it at least 51% certain that the person who did the Lake Berryessa murder is not the person who did the Blue Rock Springs murder.
Okay, and the last one is your suspect in the Paul Stein murder was named Charles Brummel. Did I get it right?
Robert Brummel.
Robert Brummel. Excuse me for that. Robert Brummel. How certain are you that Robert Brummel committed the Stein murder?
51%.
And one more time, I would like to thank Eddie McNamara for appearing on Black Box Online Radio's Zodiac Monday. And Eddie has made a lot of observations about the case that I think are quite different than the majority of Zodiac Killer researchers. So one more time, I would truly invite you to put your feedback in the comments section down below. What do you think about some of the suspects that he has been proposing, whether it's the Vallejo Thrill Killers or George Waters? I would really like to know what you guys think. And this is a book that is going to receive a lot of criticism, and one person who has been very critical of it is Tom Voigt of Zodiackiller.com, who issued a post, or I guess you would say sent out a newsletter that says, "Almost before my eyes could focus on the free Amazon preview, I quickly spotted this error. For new Zodiac books, the bar has gotten ridiculously low over the last number of years. But screwing up AM and PM, and what this refers to is there's a place in Eddie McNamara's book where he stated that the phone call that came after the Blue Rock Springs shooting came at 12:40 p.m., when in reality it came at 12:40 a.m. on July 5th of 1969. Seriously, in a book you have to pay for, no, it's not nitpicking, and stop apologizing for this stuff. What else got overlooked? What other mistakes were made? Crap like this makes me embarrassed to be associated with the Zodiac case. But hey, the coffee cup salesmen now have new content to post." The coffee cup salesman. Well, I think that can only be directed at me because of that buymeacoffee.com segment that I did at the beginning, and I do every Monday here on Zodiac Monday. But firstly, Eddie McNamara most likely knows that the call after the Blue Rock Spring shooting came at 12:40 a.m. on July 5th of 1969. But I mean, most of the time Tom Voigt does back these things up when he is trying to be factual and he's trying to be accurate, and I have to give him credit for that. Now, as far as calling out the coffee cup salesman who now has new content to post, if that is a stab at the way that I do things here on Black Box Online Radio, it's really interesting that it comes from Tom Voigt, because do you guys know why I use buymeacoffee.com? Because of Tom Voigt, because he was using it, because I saw it in the description box of a video on his YouTube channel called Zodiac Killer Official. For years, I had nothing to do with donation pages. Even when the channel was monetized, I had nothing to do with donation pages. I did actually have Black Box Online Radio coffee cups, which still might be floating around on the internet somewhere, and I had a t-shirt page, but the real reason why I do that segment, the supporter shoutouts, is because the audience requested it. I've said this once and I'll say it again. Maybe 30 or 40 times, people were saying, "Hey, do you have a PayPal or a Venmo or something where I can just send you some money?" And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, you don't got to do anything like that. I mean, what about like a t-shirt or something? They're like, "No, I don't really want one of those, but I'll gladly send you something via PayPal." And to this day, I have not put my PayPal on any of the Black Box Online Radio episodes. But then I saw this thing, buymeacoffee.com, and I was like, okay, this one has a little bit of character. But ultimately, I really hope that that doesn't become a major distraction. But yeah, I saw it in the description box of one of Tom Voigt's videos, and I thought, you know what, it's finally time to use it, because 40 people are saying that they want to do something like this. I gave in. And I've received a lot of backlash for it over the years, but at the same time, I also recognize that people can do what they want, and they're invited to, support any YouTube channel that is requesting this type of stuff. And ultimately, I totally recognize that there is a need for accuracy. And as I said, Tom Voigt mostly backs up his points in that regard, but I also hope that people will look at the central ideas that are in Eddie's book, Zodiactually, and they're welcome to challenge those, and I think that those should be the things that people challenge first. But let me know what you think about anything that you heard in the interview. Let me know what you think about Eddie's theory, his multiple hypotheses and observations that he has put forward, because there's a lot of stuff that went in that interview. Just please let me know in the comment section down below. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. And of course, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And the shorts and reels come out on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. And that will be all from me now, and I will be with you guys tomorrow for a new episode about JonBenet Ramsey, but I also want to let you know that this show is available for free downloads anywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. You can also view the images that you see going by on the screen at True Crime Designs on Facebook. True Crime Designs. Please follow. And for now, goodbye.